Whether you believe that remote work is dead or the office is dead, it's sort of a bit of a tug of war. And the challenge is neither fully remote nor fully in the office is actually what most people want. The research that we've done for the past 3 years shows the same thing almost every quarter, which is people want flexibility. The vast majority of people want something in the middle. It's great being here with all of you today for HR Congress's Tech Fest. Really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of insights and a little bit of information. I'm Brian Elliott. My group at Future Forum over the last 3 years did a lot of research on what's working and what's not when it comes to hybrid and flexible work. My group at Future Forum over the last 3 years did a lot of research over what's working and what's not when it comes to flexible work. I'm going to share a lot of that with you today, but I'm also going to share some of the research that I've seen more recently and been working on for the past 6 months, along with a lot of what I've learned from talking through this with executives at literally hundreds of companies that are wrestling with what's the right way to move forward in terms of how you make work for individuals and for organizations. And so you've all seen the headlines. This is in the news on a regular basis. Whether you believe that remote work is dead or the office is dead, it's sort of a bit of a tug of war. And the challenge is neither fully remote nor fully in the office is actually what most people want. The research that we've done for the past 3 years shows the same thing almost every quarter, which is people want flexibility. The vast majority of people want something in the middle. On average, most people want a day or two a week with their team for relationships and socialization as much as they want it for collaboration. But you can see in the chart, there's just a wide range of what people want. 20% of the workforce on a global basis need an office 5 days a week because home just doesn't work for them. There's about 15% of the global workforce that wants to be fully remote, meaning with their team less than once a month, maybe once a quarter. When you look at that spread, though, of what people want, it's actually a big driver these days of people's expectations when it comes to their workplace. About 75% of people globally are open to new roles if they don't get the flexibility that they desire. McKinsey did a recent piece of research as well that showed that 50% of middle managers would quit or take a pay cut if they were forced back into the office 5 days a week. The forced march 5 days a week is kind of a dying breed. But there's this big tug of war that's going on. And over the course of the past 2.5, 3 years, there's been a growing chorus of, in some quarters, senior executive, especially CEO and board desires to get people to return to the office. The challenge is that those continuous, headline-making pronouncements are having less and less effect. If you look at the Castle Systems data in the US in particular, what you see is a flattening of the curve. So each one of these return to office pushes has less and less impact on what's going on. So the curve today sits at about 50% of pre-pandemic norms in terms of office occupancy in the United States. By the way, 50% of pre-pandemic probably means more like 25% actual occupancy, because most of those open office floor plans were only about half occupied in the first place. So with all the noise in the press about everybody going back to work, it's not really having much impact at the end of the day. If you dig a little bit deeper, what you can do is look at things like Flex Index. Flex Index actually digs into the policies of over 5,000 different organizations in the United States in particular, and charts what they're doing and how they're doing over time. And what you see over the course of the last 6 months alone is a shift towards more flexibility. There are fewer companies that are doing 5 days a week on site. There are more organizations that are moving to either a structured hybrid program, the most popular of which is a minimum number of days per week, or they're moving into some form of employee choice, meaning employees get to choose whether they want to work from home, work from an office, or work somewhere in between, coffee shop, co-working facility, et cetera. Those are the sort of programs that are becoming more popular. The challenge is a lot of those hybrid programs, almost what I would call overly structured programs, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday are the 3 days a week that we want you in the office, meet a lot of resistance. They meet resistance for two big reasons. One is what's called reactance theory. Human beings, when told explicitly what to do on something that we are all adults and should be able to figure out, just don't react well to it in the first place. Second, the issue is if you say, I need you in 3 or 4 days a week to be with your team, what you're ignoring is the fact that most teams these days are distributed. I've led and managed teams for over 25 years myself. For 20 plus of those years, my teams have not resided in the same city, let alone shown up to work in the same building. And that trend of distributed teams has gotten way stronger in a post-pandemic world. If you look at pre-pandemic, what this looked like, and this is data from Microsoft, about 60% of teams were co-located, meaning in the same geographic area. If you look today, 2/3 of teams are only partially co-located, meaning some aspect of your team sits outside the city where you are. It is vital that we give managers the tools, experience, training, and know-how to lead distributed teams. It's just where we are. You can't unscramble this egg at this point in time. So let's talk a little bit about what does work from a research perspective and from a variety of different companies in different industries. The data on the chart shows information from a survey that Boston Consulting Group did just this spring. And what they did is they polled over 1,500 people and they asked them a couple of questions. What's the policy of your company when it comes to workplaces? Are you fully in the office? Are you some form of structured hybrid? Are you fully remote? What are you actually doing? Are you complying with those policies? And how satisfied are you with your company's policies? The highest compliance and the highest satisfaction comes from a program that I would describe as hybrid key events. What this means is that instead of a top-down mandate of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or the days that everyone's expected to be in the office, you actually let teams figure out what their cadence looks like. And what I mean by that is, for example, the cadence of a sales team might be that they want to be together 2 days a week on a regular basis, or an engineering organization might want to be together once a month for a week. So that's a team level agreement that comes in place. And then key events can be really important things like onboarding of new employees, new team formation, the kickoff of a major cross-functional initiative, and importantly, things like minimum standards of quarterly gatherings. Those types of programs have the highest compliance and the highest employee satisfaction. It's actually much higher, as you would expect, than full-time in the office. It's also higher than fully remote. Reason for that, keep in mind, not everybody wants to be fully remote. If you look at organizations that are doing this today, you see a wide range of companies that aren't just in the tech space. Allstate is one of my favorites. They got rid of the massive corporate headquarters in suburban Chicago, now have 7 regional centers, and they've allowed teams to figure out what their cadence looks like. That might mean that a marketing content team comes together 3 days a week, but a marketing analyst team might only come together once a month. All of these organizations are also some of the fastest growing organizations out there. Many of them see double-digit growth rates even through the pandemic and post-pandemic, and their ability to attract talent is a key reason. I'm going to touch on a couple of other data points. One is the benefits of flexibility. Number one, and this one's personally important to me, is flexibility creates an opportunity for more inclusive organizations. We've seen this consistently. Working moms, especially in the United States and in the UK, want to work from home more often than working fathers and the people without children. And the reasons for this are around childcare and primary caregiving status. And especially when you've got a caregiving crisis going on inside of your country, this becomes increasingly important. The other thing that we've seen is if you look at US job applicants, they stratify them by fully in office, what they call telework, which is hybrid, some form of flexibility, and fully remote. They get way more job applicants for remote and telework jobs that are women, that are veterans, that are people with disabilities, than they do for full-time in office. In the US, we've also seen a really great series of upsurges in employment among women with young children and all-time highs for people with disabilities. Flexibility creates this real opportunity to create a more level playing field. It also creates real risks around proximity bias, that senior executives go back to rewarding people who come into the office more often, who tend to be more white, male, primary caregivers like myself. If we do that, while we may help from an employment perspective, we're certainly not going to be helping from how we actually fix a leaky pipeline when it comes to diversity in management ranks. Flexibility also has a couple of other key benefits. First, productivity. There's a wide range of studies that are out there. I've got a bunch of them listed in the footnotes on this. Glad to talk to anybody about this. You can look at stuff from Nick Bloom that says it's positive 13%. You can look at stuff from Nick that says it's positive 4%. You can read a study that Nick read and said it's negative 10. It really depends on how well you manage your team around outcomes and you hold them accountable to it when it comes to location flexibility. The other part that's way more important is schedule flexibility. If we spent less time talking about how many days a week people need to be in the office and more time teaching people how to collaborate asynchronously, and use our meeting times for debates, decisions, and development of people, we would get wicked more productivity out of our staff. In our research, people who had flexibility in their schedules, constraints on the hours that are available for meetings, and more focused time had 39% higher productivity scores than people who don't. In order to get there, and in order to do that type of enablement, we need to get out of meetings-driven culture and the assumption that a 30-minute Zoom meeting is the solution for all known problems. We need to invest in new tools and new technology. And if you do, you get real paybacks. Over the course of 3 years at Future Forum, we actually measured the distance between companies who were technology laggards and those who were technology leaders. And at the beginning of the pandemic, the difference in things like productivity was pretty small. It was about a 20% difference, a 1.2x multiple. Today, it's a 1.6x multiple. This is winter of 2023 data. There's a big difference if you are providing your organization with the tools they need to be productive, if you're providing the training that they need to share information asynchronously, but to also come together at key moments. Those digital tools, though, do a lot more than just stitch together productivity. They also provide the backbone for distributed teams when it comes to belonging. That's why we see over a 2x higher score for people's sense of belonging in digital innovators than we do in digital laggards. Think about it. If you are running an employee resource group, if you're running the women's ERG or the Black employees ERG, you often have those people scattered around different offices in different locations. Digital is often a way for them to come together. We also have 2 generations of digital natives in the workforce. Technology becomes a backbone for their connection. But we're not stopping there. The next part of this ride is going to be massive, which is the impact of generative AI. We're starting to see the impact already in terms of people's personal efficiency, what people are doing to kickstart their own creative work in terms of using ChatGPT, how people are starting to use these tools to automate the routine in their day-to-day work. Finding ways to support teams in doing this while not letting information get out into the public is a really big, important task going forward. But even if you think what I've talked about already when it comes to flexibility, there's a lot that these tools can provide us to make us more effective, more efficient, and more connected. I'll give you one really easy example, which is meetings. We all know the problem. You show up for the meeting, you have to be there because you've got FOMO, fear of missing out, because if you're not there, you have no idea what happened, what's going on. A recording of a meeting that an AI tool can automatically transcribe, summarize the discussion, but also decisions made and next steps, and then share that out publicly can go a long way towards improving meeting efficiency and getting rid of FOMO. There's a lot more here to be done over time. That kind of information and sharing, though, is only one part of the story here. There's a much bigger factor than just the inclusion factor and just the time factor alone. And the big issue is trust at the end of the day. While a lot of executives are worried about people quiet quitting on them, what we've seen is growing and mounting evidence that trust is actually what drives organizational performance. I4CP, Institute for Corporate Profitability, released a study this summer where they took organizations and stratified them by high-performing organizations, fast growth, profitable organizations in an industry, versus low. The single biggest indicator of difference between those organizations was whether or not people felt trusted by their leadership. Slack put out a similar piece of research this summer, which said that employees who feel trusted are not only more productive, but they're much more likely to stick around and they're much more likely to put in the extra effort. Let's put it this way. If I believe that you trust me, I'm much more likely to go the extra mile for our customers than if you're telling me that I need to be in the office 4 days a week and signaling to me that you don't really trust me. That trust has one more big impact, and that's innovation. Time and again, I've heard the argument we need to be back in the office because we need to be around a whiteboard or the water coolers to drive innovation. The single biggest driver of innovation is psychological safety. People's feeling that they are trusted by their leadership and their management. This is true from Google research back in 2015, which was spectacular. We repeated some of the same studies in 2022. And what we found is that geographic location had nothing to do with your team's creativity, virtually no correlation whatsoever. What did is a couple of key questions. Do I feel comfortable asking for help? Is my team willing to take risks? Those are both indicators of psychological safety, that I feel trusted in my team, and my team feels a sense of trust in the organization that they can take risks and not be punished for them. Last is investment in new processes. It'll be a really quick, easy example. Instead of the whiteboard and brainstorming next time, try brainwriting. Give your team the prompt. Give them the information and knowledge that they need in order to sort through the problem that you're facing. Ask them to spend a couple of hours jotting down, not long form, 3 or 5 bullet points of ideas they've got of how that problem might be solved. Don't ask them to share them until you come together. Throw all of those ideas together into a collaborative document, into something that you can share with each other, then talk about it. You'll get a lot more ideas that way than you would have if you're standing there holding the pen. At the end of the day, what people need is flexibility within a framework around all this. We need to come to team level agreements and have guardrails about how frequently people need to come together, maybe once a quarter, not top-down mandates and policies. We need to figure out all of this at the team level. Top-down mandates don't work, but neither do individual free-for-alls. We need to move from attendance as our marker of productivity, or activity itself being a marker of productivity, to outcomes-driven leadership. Are we actually accomplishing our goals? And all of this really means we need to invest heavily in the skills and training and tools and support for our frontline managers. All of this sounds like a lot of work, and it can be. But at the end of the day, if you're facing challenges in your organization, my number one recommendation is pick one. You're not going to solve all these problems at once. If you've got productivity concerns, let's talk about it as a team. Let's focus there. If you're worried about innovation, let's think about intentional redesign about how we do it. Maybe we should try a little brainwriting around it. There's a big, wide world ahead of us in terms of how we rethink the role of tools and space in how we work. But the most essential ingredient at the end of the day is your team. How do you build trust and belonging inside of your organization? How do I give you the flexibility to work where and when you're at your best and still build the relationships that we all need to be effective leaders in our organizations? Thanks much. Mihai, back to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was amazing. And certainly we still have a couple of minutes for questions. And there's so much to unwrap from this presentation. There's so much in it and so much details and information. So I really appreciate you sharing it. Let me ask you, the data and the research you shared, it was mainly US focused, wasn't it? Do you have information data about how flexible work emerges from post-pandemic in Europe, Asia Pacific?
All the future form research was global in nature. So we studied 7 different countries: US, UK, Germany, France, Japan, Australia. And the trends across those countries varied slightly, but the overall message was exactly the same, 2.5 years running, in terms of people's desire for flexibility. Somewhere in the 80% of range, between 80 and 85% of people want location flexibility. Somewhere between 92 and 95% of people want schedule flexibility, some constraints on meetings. That hasn't changed from 2021 to 2023 in any country. And so it's a human desire, right? People have different needs. I work better in the morning myself, not in the late evening. So give me an uninterrupted chunk then, and I'll get a lot done with it. So that's pretty true. There are some trend differences in terms of things like how frequently people are coming back into the office. And I think a lot more of that, if you dig into the data, is attributable to things like local conditions in the market. So I'll give you an example. In the US and in the UK, where there are longer commutes into central business districts and more, and people tend to, and especially in the US, have larger homes that are more comfortable, you're just in a different set of trade-offs than you are in Mumbai, where you're in a small apartment, you have a multi-generational family potentially, and the office is a little bit more inviting. Public transportation is actually pretty good. There's literally differences between like Mumbai and other cities in India in terms of how long the commute is, and therefore how much people are coming back into the office. So it has a lot more to do with your personal living situation than it has to do with massive cultural differences, which is what most people assume.
Definitely. And of course, I hear very often using hybrid and flexible kind of interchangeably, but it's very two distinctly different way of working, because hybrid is just all about where the work is done, but flexible gives you more freedom of choice rather as an individual, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of my challenges is I've never liked the word hybrid, because hybrid focuses only on that one dimension of where. And honestly, the where dimension is the least important part. When we work is more important than where, and how we work is infinitely more important. That's why, like, talking with your team and building an agreement around things like not just how often we come together, but what are our constraints on meetings? what tools do we use for what purpose? How do we put some constraints around always on notifications going off that lead to burnout? Those how questions are much more important than just the location question. And so that flexibility topic gets really rich if you get into rethinking and redesigning how we work.
Indeed. And these days we are all living in a somewhat a laboratory. In the UK, there's a very successful experiment with four-day work week, which is again another part of the whole equation.
I'd love to see more experimentation and results out of experiments like that, which is actually great to see. And there's ways that I've seen organizations struggle with, how do I put constraints around how much time my people are spending that is actually administrivia or too many meetings that are status updates. Whether it's, if the 4-day work week is successful, it's successful because what it does is it squishes out some of the sort of waste of work, right? All of the stuff, which is essentially human routing of information, as opposed to using tools to do that more effectively. If we can do that and compress out that part of it and give people the headspace to do heads down work in 4 days and give them 3-day longer weekends, that's fantastic. There's also ways you can do that within your own organization. We did 9 a.m. until 1 o'clock West Coast time in the US for a North America-based team as our core collaboration hours. All of our meetings, chats, conversations happened in that span. And that way you knew that you weren't going to have internally scheduled meetings on Friday or after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which meant that you had a little more flexibility and freedom to either do focused work or deal with a childcare situation.
And indeed, that's in a way, it was a nice way to bring to the next question on the table, because exactly what I wanted to ask. You mentioned the skills, leadership skills in leading flexible distributed teams. And I think we cannot overemphasize the importance of it. It's really true. It can make it or break it, the whole teamwork and psychological safety and trust. So you are coming from a very strong practical background, being a former SVP at Slack. Can you just tell me about your story, how it happened at Slack, and what are some of the practical tips, challenges you faced, and how did your team overcome those challenges?
Yeah. So Slack itself pre-pandemic was not a remote first team by any stretch of the imagination.
Interestingly, though.
Yeah, we were less than 3% remote. Everybody assumes that we had this figured out beforehand. We did not. We sort of stumbled into this like everybody else. It was messy and sloppy and all the rest of it. And had some pretty hearty debates about what the right solution was here. I think, like everybody else, when everyone is forced into a fully remote, it was easier than when offices reopened. That's when the real discussion starts, where you have to sit there as an executive team and talk about it, but you also have to talk with your team and listen to the people in your organization, to what works for them and how they work. That's how we took the team agreements approach. The other part that I would say is Slack actually had a really great managerial training philosophy, which is your job as a manager is to do 3 things. Number 1, create clarity around goals and objectives, around roles and responsibilities for people on your team, around priorities. And that's really essential. Second one is building trust, right? Your job as a manager is to build an environment where people feel safe raising an issue or a problem or a challenge, as opposed to squashing it until it's too late. And that means you've got to be vulnerable as a manager, and that skill can be hard to learn and hard to see how it works. And the third one is unlocking potential in your team. And that really is, how do you think about how we're going to achieve the goals that we've got as a broader organization, but how do we continue to coach and train people? So the job of a manager is not about being a monitor, right? It's actually about being a coach and helping people succeed, because that's how you're going to get them and the rest of your goals accomplished in the first place.
Now, here's an interesting question with coaching and learning on the job. You mentioned Mumbai as a geographical example. I would like to mention age as a differentiator, whether you want to go in the office or not. Our generation, we have a comfy home. We're very happy work from home because we have family commitments and other challenges, other priorities. But younger generation, they actually, not only they not necessarily have the right settings at home, being a few of them probably sharing an apartment, but also they're happy to go in the office, the networking in the office more important. So how has the face of learning, on-the-job learning and development and coaching changed because of flexibility? And how can we ensure that the knowledge from the senior leaders are actually successfully passed on to the younger generation?
Great. And I actually think that's probably the most important conversation in all of this, because innovation, culture, connection, all that is completely doable. The younger generation actually doesn't want either one of the extremes. They're least likely to want to be 5 days a week in the office as they are to want to be 5 days a week fully remote. They want something that's more in the middle. It's people my age that want both extremes, right? More likely to want one or the other. The balance point in this is intentional design and thinking about what you're doing in order to coach people. The process by which you expect that people learn because you simply plunk them down in an open office floor plan is basically relying on random chance. And by the way, the people that it favors is the people who look like the vast majority in that organization, right? And it doesn't work terribly well, to be honest, in a lot of situations. So think instead about like, how do I use the tools that are, regardless of where I happen to be co-located or not, I can use to coach people along the way. Here's a couple of easy examples. A salesperson doing a sales call should have a conversation with their manager after they both experienced, what the customer said, both to ask the salesperson, what did they hear? Did they digest it properly? But also any feedback of, here's what you might have tried differently along the way. What I just described there doesn't matter if you happen to have all been in the same conference room with the customer, or if the three of you were dialed in on Zoom, right? It's that phone call afterwards or that in-person conversation afterwards that matters, because it's timely, it's direct, and it's about, something that they can act on. Same thing is true, for example, with a designer who's working on something in Figma. It's pretty easy to either sit next to somebody and show that to them and have them point at it, or to screen share it with their manager. And let's go over it together, point at different aspects of it that could be improved, done differently. How did you think about this? That's how coaching actually happens, is through those interactive moments. And those interactions can either be digitally enabled or they can be physical. But it's more about making sure managers know how to have those moments.
Indeed. And of course, without this, neither trust nor psychological safety cannot be achieved. But you also mentioned technologies being a backbone. Of course, we are at the HR Congress TechFest, many of our audience joining in to learn about some of the possible technologies without mentioning some brands. But what are some of the tools? You mentioned generative AI, but beyond that, what are some of the tools that would enable leaders, HR practitioners as well, to champion flexibility in their organization?
I think one of the biggest ones that I want to raise on that is, it's not just the tools, it's the training of the tools, and it's actually getting people at all levels to understand and use them, right? So part of the issue that we have here is we have two generations of digital natives in the workforce that are quite used to using tools like Slack and like Teams for conversations that are, connections as much as it is for the work itself. There are people like me who might be my age who are a little more resistant on that front, right? And the challenge that we face is, if they're not in the tools, they don't see what's going on in their own organizations. And I've experienced this firsthand in a lot of executive conversations where people say, my boss or I am coming back into the office, but I'm not hearing the buzz and the hubbub of conversation. I'm worried that we're either losing sort of the understanding of how the business is performing, and I'm concerned because the economy is tightening, or that we just don't have the culture any longer. Some of the same executives say, but you can find me over here in email. I don't do Teams or Slack. That's for the kids, right? The problem with that is you're missing out on all those conversations. You're missing out on the people who are working on the next account plan or trying to close that big deal. You're missing out on the product that's actually, kind of slipping sideways on somebody. And you're also missing out on the social aspects of it. And so as executives, we need to get into these tools ourselves and learn how to use them. That's really critically important. And the reason why this matters is, if as organizations, we can't figure out how to shift from email to asynchronous collaboration tools like Slack, like Teams, how are we expecting that we're all going to adapt to generative AI, right? We're just talking about the basics of collaboration. This requires a major investment in thinking about like a much more digital first mindset at all levels of the organization. That requires enablement, that it requires training, use cases, you name it. But we've got to spend the time there and stop wasting the amount of energy we are on arguing over how many days a week people should be in the office.
Indeed. I mean, we could now transition to another presentation about digital transformation, as fool with a tool is still a fool. So the training, coaching guide is just so important. Brian, thank you so much. We are out of time for today, but it's been an absolutely brilliant, fascinating session. If people would like to get in touch with you, what is the best way to reach out to you?
LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Brian Elliott. Pretty easy to locate. Mihai, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure.